Welcome to the Prospective Doctor podcast, brought to you by Med School Coach. Each week we cover topics related to the pre-med journey to medical school and beyond, from the MCAT to completing your application and from starting medical school to choosing a specialty. Our podcast will provide essential information for anyone contemplating a career in medicine.
Hi everyone, this is Dr. Ziggy Yoediono from Med School Coach. Thanks for joining me. Today I'm really excited to introduce you to Jane, who is a recent med school applicant as well as a med school coach client. So because Jane just finished the med school application process with spectacular results, I thought this would be the perfect time to get some fresh first-hand advice about how to ace the traditional interview. So welcome, Jane.
Thank you so much for having me, Ziggy.
My pleasure. So I'm going to dive right in and start off with this question. So for better or worse, was there anything that really surprised you about the med school interview process? And if so, can you briefly share it with us?
Yeah, there are plenty of things that surprised me, and there's no experience like going through it yourself to figure that out. But a few things that stood out that I wish I had known. Well, the first being that interview days are really long. They are exhausting, and you have to be at 100% the whole day long. Mm-hmm. And the whole day, med students and faculty ask you if you have any questions for them. And so I remember at my first interview, the night before, I'd prepared a few questions, I think about 5. And within the first half hour, nearly all my questions were answered. And so the rest of the day, I was rapidly trying to think of new things to ask, because you're constantly asked if you have any questions and you want to be highly engaged. So it's pretty exhausting to have to be at 100% the whole day. They have a welcome presentation, usually a tour, curriculum presentation, diversity presentations, and then usually at the very end of the day, you'll have your interview, or some schools do it at the beginning. Mm-hmm. But it's a long day, and that definitely surprised me, because you think like, oh, 2 30-minute interviews, that should be a piece of cake. But there's a lot that's going on during the day that might influence how you respond to your interview and the questions they ask you.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, I think that's an underappreciated part of the interview process for the reasons you mentioned. And just so out of curiosity, like after you sort of got the sense that these were going to be long days, did you do anything to sort of like get that extra boost of energy? Was like the adrenaline enough, or did you have to like rely on caffeine a little bit, or was there something else?
Well, it's funny you ask that. Okay, this is kind of personal, but I would actually go to the bathroom when I was feeling like I needed a little break, because you're constantly around people. So sometimes I would just go there and like center myself and kind of collect my thoughts. That was helpful. And then normally I made coffee before. They do have coffee usually at the breakfast, mm-hmm. But I guess depending on how much you need, it's kind of an odd look to be guzzling like a huge cup in the morning of your interview. So I would suggest caffeinating before.
That's true. All right, that's a good part. That's a good point. But I do like the part about actually taking time sometimes throughout the day to sort of escape sort of the hubbub and the chaos, and to sort of center yourself so you can kind of reset for whatever else is coming up next, basically. I think that's a really great piece of advice, Jane. Perfect. My next question is, one of the biggest issues, when applying to med school is time management, right? Given that many of you are in school or have a job or, doing something else, obviously. So that being said, what advice do you have in terms of optimizing time management, when it comes to both scheduling and attending the interviews?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I was in school when I applied, and a lot of my teachers were pretty flexible and understanding when I was traveling, just like people are for other job interviews. So I was able to get some extensions on projects and things like that. But it did help me a lot to choose classes that were more flexible to begin with, or maybe a lighter course load, because when you are interviewing, it takes time to travel and to prepare and to interview the whole day. So you're looking at losing about 2 full days per interview, at least in my experience, in terms of mental preparation and traveling and such. Another thing that surprised me was the lack of flexibility in scheduling. So most med schools will give you maybe 3 or 4 options of when to schedule your interview, but they'll usually, depending on the school, be within a pretty narrow range. So some schools only offer interviews on like Fridays and Mondays, or on Wednesdays. So there's less flexibility than I thought. Like, for example, I had 2 interviews in the same state, and they were 1 month apart, but I was not able to combine those 2 dates. So I actually had to go twice, which is a bummer, because everything's on your own budget.
Yes. Yeah. So there's also the sort of cost issue, especially when you have to fly out to different places, basically. So obviously it would have made it easier if you could have flown out that one time, combined the 2 different medical school interviews, and saved an extra trip and also money.
Yeah. But it's hard to schedule every detail, because you could get interviews anywhere from August through February. So it's hard to combine these things or no, because sometimes you won't even be offered an interview until January.
Exactly. So, your first piece of advice was really that I found that really fascinating, because about the sort of scheduling and optimizing time management, you took a really long-term perspective because you sort of mentioned taking into account what your courses are going to be, basically, which I am willing to bet most people don't even think about it in that way, right? They deal with it much closer when they think they're going to have interviews, basically. But it's an interesting, and it makes sense to keep in mind, given that that these interviews are going to happen like end of summer, fall, spring, to sort of think ahead, basically, about what your course load might be or the rigor of it, and take that into account.
Yeah, definitely. And even before then, I front-loaded a lot of my pre-medical courses so that I could use senior year more as a break and have more flexibility. So it was almost like my reward to take less classes and then also to have the flexibility to travel for interviews.
Yeah, wow. See, this is strategic forward thinking at its best, folks. All right, good. Thanks, Jane. All right, so here's the next thing. So can you take us through your process in terms of how you actually prepared for your interviews, and sort of to piggyback off that, looking back, what did you feel worked well and why so? And maybe perhaps even more importantly, what would you have done differently and also why so?
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so way early on, you can start by just thinking about the most common medical school interview questions, like tell us about yourself. Why do you want to be a doctor? Why do you want to go into medicine? And why do you want to go to this specific school? Now, that last question will take some more research on their website. What I would do is I'd go on the website, explore every little thing, write down the programs I was interested in, write down the questions I had on their curriculum. That's like the gathering information stage. But for the other questions, they require a lot of introspection, kind of like the secondary application. So for that, what I did, taking the advice of my advisor, I started with bulleted lists of things, of like my responses to these common questions. So taking each question, what was the goal? What was the interviewer trying to gain? And how could I answer that in a concise narrative? Because I think the most common trope is that people start to ramble because they don't have a concise point they're trying to make. So making bulleted lists for each question was super helpful, and also in going back and refining those points. Now, writing is one thing, and talking is another thing.
Exactly.
So one thing that I really struggled with was making my responses not sound rehearsed or robotic. I would be so focused on hitting all my points that I would fail to have a conversation. And that was something I really practiced with med school coach in the mock interview sessions. Mm-hmm. That I think has been one of the most helpful things in this entire process. And I would highly suggest to anyone to do these mock interviews. They're more than worth it. Basically what happens in one of these sessions is you're paired with an advisor, and you can choose the type of interview you want to do or what you want to focus on. And then it'll be just like an actual interview. So they'll ask you questions, you'll give your responses, and at the end, you'll work on strategies on how to improve. So what I did is I had the unlimited package, and I was able to do a bunch of interviews with different people, and every person gives different advice, and every person is also different, like the interviewers you'll see on the interview trail. So specifically in the traditional interview, it really matters if you, I don't want to say vibe with the person that you're matched with, but some people click and some people don't. But I think the most important thing is to realize you don't have any control over who you're paired with. And the best physicians will be the ones that can make themselves accessible to the most people. So I think it's actually pretty good practice for learning how to talk to people and find what you have in common, and really try to make the conversation as conversational as possible. I think the best interviews I had felt like conversations. You'll probably hear this a lot, but the awkward ones are ones where they just rattle off a list of questions, and it feels like you just give your prepared responses. So even if you feel like you have nothing in common with the person sitting across from you, there must be something. And so I think you mentioned things I would do, or you asked what I would do differently.
Yeah.
And for me, one thing I quickly learned is that the questions are not really asked in the order that you prepare them. And sometimes they're asked in a different way. And so again, this is why it's so important to be conversational. So some people will ask you something that will get you talking about maybe like your family or an experience or a challenge you had. And I think if you are so used to giving like a certain response, you maybe aren't ready for every question. So I think I never really nailed the why medicine question. It was asked to me in a bunch of different ways throughout the interview process. And I would always get very nervous about it. And every night before, like I would practice 3 questions that came up the most number of times. That tell me about yourself, why medicine, and why this specific school. Yeah. And so I would get nervous every time, and I think had I practiced more and really drilled that question home, I would have been a lot less nervous for my interview days.
Okay. All right. That's so helpful, Jane. And sort of extrapolate from this great advice you gave. I sort of think of these 3 P's. Preparation, point, and practice. And I would say that, based on my experience, I think clients tend to underestimate the importance of the preparation and the point, because people often feel like, well, I'm talking about myself, so I don't, I know myself better than anybody, but I don't need to practice. And if you don't, as Jane sort of pointed out, you can sort of tend to ramble and not actually have, a point to the response that you're giving basically. And in terms of the point itself, what I mean by that is actually understanding the point of the question that's being asked of you, basically. Because if you don't understand the point, you're not going to give the right answer. And I think that's commonly seen for the why do you want to come to our medical school question, where people often misinterpret it to mean, what's so wonderful about our medical school? And then they do this laundry list of wonderful things about the med school, which the interviewer does not need to know because they know more about the med school than probably the interviewee, basically. And it should be more personalized to why you're a good fit for the medical school. So that is wonderful, wonderful advice. So let me ask you this, while we're on the topic of just interview questions, what, if any, did you find to be the most challenging interview questions, and, what made them challenging for you, and how would you, what would your advice be on crafting, a really good answer to such a question?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, I really struggled with the why medicine question.
Yes.
And a lot of times interviewers will ask you that question, but disguised. So, like, for example, one interviewer asked me, what does illness mean to me? And that was their way of asking, why do I want to go into medicine? And so some people could take the philosophical route. Some people could talk about their own experience with illness. And so that one caught me off guard. Another funny way of asking the why medicine question was, and the interviewer asked me, what would I want to do if I was not a doctor? And so I said, maybe, I've been interested in bioethics. Maybe I would want to be a lawyer. And then he followed up with, well, why do you want to be a doctor? Like, why are you not going to be a lawyer?
Right.
And so that was a new way of thinking about that question. Another challenging question that I remember is I had worked a lot with underserved populations and cared a lot about that. And one of my interviewers asked what my experience was with people of other races that were not in those contexts, so outside of helping the underserved. And, that question really got me to pause and think about that. So you'll get some really introspective comments that you wish you'll have more than 10 seconds to think of an answer to.
Exactly. Yep. I was really fascinated to hear about the part where sometimes a typical question can be asked in an atypical way, basically. But the point is sort of the same. I've never heard anybody ask, like, what does illness mean to you? But that's a fascinating sort of take on it. I actually think it's a really well-crafted question. I mean, it really makes you think pretty deeply, basically, versus the typical approach. Yeah,
and you'll have some interviewers that just read off the standard questions like a list, and you'll have some interviewers that really put their own spin on those questions. So you have to be prepared.
Exactly. So speaking of questions, sort of on the flip side, probably at the end of most of your traditional interviews, you were asked if you have any questions, right? And so I was wondering what advice you have on asking quality, the keyword being quality questions at the end of, any interview that you might have.
Yeah, definitely. In every single one of my interviews, my interviewer asks if I had questions at the end. So you should be ready. I quickly learned that the best questions are open-ended, so they're not factual. Most of your factual questions will get answered during the day, specifically programs and things like that. And also, a lot of times, the person interviewing you might not know exactly the information that you're looking for, which is another reason to stay away from factual questions. So I got paired with a pretty big range of interviewers, MDs, MBAs, students, PhDs, medical educators. You could get any one of those. And normally I would tailor my questions to that person's experience and relationship to the medical school. So like for a physician, some of the questions I liked were like, what is something you would change about this place? How do you maintain work-life balance? How do you decide a specialty? Kind of open-ended, introspective questions. So I was actually surprised by how few people asked me about my research. And so, like, in general on the interview trail, although that that bit me at the end. I can talk more about that later, but I was paired with a PhD who was really excited to hear about all my research, and so that was a totally different interview experience for me. So I asked about what sort of projects it was realistic for medical school students to get involved with, considering they have so many other things going on. And so for students, you can ask personal questions like what surprised you about this place, what's something you would change. And for educators, I usually focus more on questions about the curriculum, like what initiatives do you have put in place that make your curriculum different? What is student wellness like here? Very open-ended, introspective questions that really spark a conversation.
Yeah, no, that's great. That makes a lot of sense. And asking an open-ended question enables more of a conversation and a dialogue also, in addition just to, asking something, as you said, factual that probably is going to be answered throughout the day, basically. So you were just talking about the different kinds of questions you can ask, sort of a faculty member maybe versus, a student, basically. And so to that end, do you have anything else to add, maybe, in terms of your experience when you were interviewing with a faculty member versus a student? Any other tips on advising, for optimizing each of these interactions?
Yeah, so I actually only interviewed with one student, and that experience, it was very comfortable because this person was only a few years older than me. But I think it's really important to stay as respectful and professional as you would be with a physician, because it's easy to feel more comfortable, but this person's actually seeing not only if you would be a great doctor, but also if you would be a good classmate. So you want to be careful to not get too comfortable as you would talk with your friends, because it is still an interview.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. and that actually, to piggyback off what you said, Jane, just as a friendly reminder to all of you interviewing, just remember, you are being, whether you're in a formal interview or not, you are being evaluated the whole day, more or less, basically. So, really behave appropriately, whether you're talking to the secretary, whether you're walking down the hall, whether you meet other students sort of informally, basically. You never know who's evaluating you, who's going to provide feedback. So, I think if you just keep it simple and be professional and nice to everybody, then it should make the day go much more easily for you.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Also, in talking to other candidates, they want to see how you interact with people that might be your classmates in the future. So it's important to start those conversations, especially during lunch and things like that. They'll just leave you to chat with the other students for an hour, and I think they are taking note of how you interact with others, just more generally.
Yeah, no, it absolutely makes sense, and since you might be someone they're going to spend the next few years with, so they want to make sure they get along with you. So I was sort of reflecting on interactions I've had when I've done mock interviews, and I came up with some challenges that I think are common during interviews, and I thought I would just sort of mention each one. And if you had any thoughts about it, I would definitely love to hear it. So number one. Anxiety, I'm sure, as you know, is a common concern, that a lot of people who are interviewing experience, since a lot of them, such as yourself, were interviewing for the first time. And so, Jane, what was your experience with this? And, what advice do you have on sort of dealing with the anxiety that, I think most people are going to feel no matter what?
Yeah, especially before the first medical school interview, I had a lot of anxiety, and if it's any consolation, I'll actually be attending the school that I first interviewed at. So,
oh, that is good. Yes. Okay. That makes sense.
And I was really nervous. And I would say my advice, I mentioned the tip about centering yourself, taking a moment away. But also I channeled a lot of that energy into rereading my application, going over everything, thinking about the message I want to get across. Very intentionally the day before. Like, I could not think about anything else. And I also just would advise anyone to practice. I think once you start talking, a lot of the anxiety maybe goes away a little bit when you're not just thinking about it and just talking. So that would be my advice.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. I mean, I think to extrapolate from that, it really is sort of preparation that helps. And, just to piggyback off what you said, what I often tell clients is there's sort of like two types of anxiety. One is related to the fact that maybe you're not prepared yet, you haven't done it yet. So when you do that preparation, you're going to feel a lot better because you'll have more self-confidence. But then there's the other kind of anxiety, what I call, what's known as like butterflies in the stomach and whatever. And I don't, in all honesty, I don't think that ever goes away. I mean, I still get nervous about new things I'm going to do, even if I've prepared super well. And I think that's sort of a healthy type of anxiety to have. It's because you're excited about it. You're looking forward to it. So, just keep in mind the difference between those two kinds of things, and definitely follow what Jane said in terms of preparing to sort of alleviate the first type of anxiety, basically.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think everyone would agree that the second type of anxiety is normal, and they've probably been in your shoes, and they know it's a big deal to interview at a medical school. So
yes,
you're definitely not the only one.
Yes, and you brought up another good point, which is, sometimes we see, sometimes interviewees see the interviewer sort of as this, not adversary, but, someone who's there to ask you these tough questions or, gotcha questions maybe. And, to go piggyback off what you said, remember, they're there to really help you, basically. They empathize with what you're going through. They've gone through it. And if you've been invited out there, they really want to see the best in you. And they're, I think, most of the interviewers are going to do their best to sort of bring out the best in you, basically. So just keep that in mind. Jane, did you feel like that was sort of your experience with the people that you interviewed with?
Yeah, people really care. If they're taking the time to interview, they really they're invested in the type of students at their institution, and they really want to see you succeed and see you there. And so I never felt like anyone was trying to get me.
Okay, good. And don't, guys, don't, obviously, if you stumble or you say, or whatever, obviously we try not to do that. But if you do, that is not going to be the end all be all. I've never docked anybody during an interview because they looked nervous or stumbled. If anything, I felt more empathic as I sort of engaged with them. So definitely keep that in mind. So Jane, you sort of alluded to this before in terms of like sometimes you get this tough question where you're like, oh my goodness. But, what about questions, I think this has happened to all of us where your mind suddenly goes blank. You just can't think of anything like right in that second. Hopefully you didn't, but did you have any experience similar to this? And, what's your advice on dealing with that sort of, blank moment in your head?
Yeah, that's a tough situation to be in, and I don't know if there's any golden advice for it, but I can talk about. One of my interviews, I got asked a really specific question about my research from several years ago, and this is actually something I wish I'd prepared more, since I'd prepared a lot for my first few interviews, but this was actually for my last interview. And I'd found I was preparing to talk about my research a lot, and no one asked me about my research. And so I stopped spending as much time preparing for my research, and then I got a very specific question about it. So, and that was a fair question because they can ask you about anything in your application.
Yes.
So normally, in that situation, I would say, like, that's a great question. I need a moment to think and gather my thoughts before I speak. And usually in the cases when it's less of a targeted question like that, the interviewer might even revise their question. So they'll keep talking and kind of reframing their question.
Okay.
And, they really don't want to get you.
Right.
So I think just just being honest about like, I just need a moment. Thank you for asking that question.
Mm-hmm.
And then definitely try to keep your answer short if you don't have a great answer.
Oh, that's really a good piece of advice. Yeah. No, and you found that sort of having that few extra seconds to sort of think about it and gather your thoughts, it did help you sort of come up with, a better answer than if you had just sort of blurted something out right away.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, good. Well, and sort of to extrapolate from what you said, the problem is, and I've seen this with a lot of interviews, the reflex reaction when you're asked a question is to immediately like open your mouth and start saying something because you feel this anxiety of somebody staring at you, waiting for a response. So you feel like I have to say something. And you can say something, but the thing you should say is what Jane just said, which is, that's a great question. Can I just have a moment to think about it? And then literally use those few seconds to take a deep breath, try to just think of one specific thing that you can start talking about basically. And sometimes, honestly, if you feel like it's a tough question, you can say like, wow, yeah, I got to be honest, I'm kind of, struggling to think, of a response right now. I think interviewers will be empathic to that basically, and they're not going to be upset because you can't. And sometimes they purposely ask challenging questions to see how you react in that situation, basically. So that's a great way to demonstrate the skill of calmness, taking a little bit of time. Great skills to have when you're a physician later on in life. The last sort of question I have about challenges is, what about unfriendly or unreactive interviewers, right? So I've had clients who, encountered such individuals, and they often left the interview, kind of feeling upset, and wondering what had gone wrong. I definitely gave advice about that, but I'd be more curious to hear what experience you had with this. Hopefully none, but if you did, what your advice would be for others.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, you really can't control who is assigned as your interviewer. So if your interviewer is reactive to you, they're probably unreactive to everyone else they've interviewed. And they might even be instructed to act that way, to not give away too much. So I would say I more had experience with interviewers that I would just call maybe odd people. Like one left really long pauses, and it was hard for me to gauge if I should if I should be talking. One it felt very conversational. And I was waiting for them to start asking me the questions like, why do you want to go into medicine? But, the whole 45-minute interview just felt like conversational. So it almost felt like I had to lead the conversation there. So this is just to say that you can't control who you get paired with, and nothing necessarily goes wrong if they don't react a certain way. I think you just have to do the best you can in each situation, and that's all you can do.
That's all you can do. No, I think that's a great point. Well, I think it sounds like, obvious advice, but I actually think a lot of people forget that basically, right? Because they sort of do the self-analysis and blame themselves for a lot of things. And I think you're right. If you feel like you've done the best you can, then that's the best you can do. And chances are, if this person interacted in that particular way with you, whether it was sort of, unemotional or bizarre or unfriendly, they interact that way with everybody. It's not like they pick and choose who they're going to sort of behave. Like that's called a personality. So it kind of extends among different people. So, the point is don't take it personally too. That's just, medicine is like the rest of humanity. There's all types of people there, basically. And you just have to learn, adaptation is very important, basically. So that is a great piece of advice, Jane. So, my final question is, if you have any other pearls of wisdom that you would like to share with our, future or current interviewees.
Yeah, I think one thing I haven't emphasized yet is that when you're interviewing, you are also sort of interviewing them. And one thing I think that really impressed my interviewers was I would really be listening to their responses and things they add throughout the interview. And then I could ask them specific follow-up questions on that to show it wasn't just my pre-prepared questions that I was asking at the end. I was taking a personal interest in that person. Also, in some of my responses, I could weave in certain things that I really liked about the school. So, for example, if the school emphasizes research and you talk about experience you have with research, if the moment presents itself and it doesn't seem forced, you can talk a little bit about how excited you would be to continue that that sort of experience and how you could see yourself there. The last thing I'll share was, so the interview day is super exhausting, but the thank you notes are so important afterwards. And that was something that I would be so exhausted after the interview day that I would not want to write the notes that night. And then, there was a bunch of school to catch up on and other things. And then sometimes it would be a full week before I sent out that thank you note. And it's really not in your best interest to wait. One, because, being prompt is most respectful to them. Right. But two, you forget exactly what you talked about the more time goes by. And so I would suggest, no matter how exhausted you are, after your interviews, to write down 3 or 4 specific things that you talked about with your interviewer, and then you can bring that up in the thank you card. Say, I really enjoyed our conversation about end-of-life care, or, I really appreciated your questions about the challenges, I'd overcome and things like that. So I think including those specific talking points in your thank you note makes it personal and makes you memorable.
Perfect advice. Perfect way to sort of end this podcast for today. Thank you so much, Jane, for taking the time to share your expertise with this, and best of luck as you embark on your career as a physician. And for those of you wanting expertise advice for any or all parts of your medical school application, definitely consider us at Med School Coach. Our advisors are physicians who have been involved with med school admissions committees, which means you are getting an insider's insight on what to expect and how to prepare. And we're at www.medschoolcoach.com. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope all of you stay safe. Take care.
Our mission is to inspire, encourage, and inform students as you journey through a rigorous and intricate process of achieving your dreams in medicine. Visit us at prospectivedoctor.com and medschoolcoach.com for more essential resources in your medical school journey and beyond.